He walked into his own mansion and saw his mother tied to a chair while his fiancée calmly sipped wine and smiled. No screams, no excuses. Just silence, the kind that means someone is about to disappear, and the mistake she made next sealed her fate forever. If this story pulled you in, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. I've got another unforgettable story dropping tomorrow. And while you're here, jump into the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing our community from all around the world. All right, let's get back into it. Victoria Crespo had never been beautiful in the way that turned heads on city streets. But at 23, standing in the visiting room of Rikers Island with a 6-month-old baby strapped to her chest, she'd possessed something far more dangerous than beauty, an unshakable will that made even hardened inmates look away. Ismail didn't remember that first visit, of course. He'd been too young. But his mother had told him the story enough times that it lived in his bones like muscle memory. His father, Rafael Crespo, had smiled at her through the bulletproof glass that day, his prison jumpsuit hanging loose on a frame that was already starting to waste away. 3 months later, he'd be dead, stabbed 17 times in the prison yard by men paid by the Giordano family, his body left as a warning to anyone who thought they could challenge the established order. Victoria had buried him in a plot so small his headstone almost touched the neighboring grave. Then she'd gone back to their apartment above Lombardi's butcher shop on Mulberry Street, packed everything they owned into 2 suitcases, and disappeared into the labyrinth of the city. For the next 15 years, she made herself invisible. She cleaned office buildings in Manhattan from midnight to 6 in the morning, worked lunch shifts at a diner in Queens, and still managed to be waiting at the apartment door when Ismail came home from school every afternoon. She never dated, never went out, never spent money on anything that wasn't food, rent, or the private tutoring sessions she somehow scraped together so her son could stay ahead of his classmates. The other neighborhood kids thought Ismail was lucky because his father was dead. It meant he didn't have to follow him into the life. It meant he could be anything. What they didn't understand was that Rafael's death hadn't freed Ismail, it had branded him. Every criminal organization in the city knew who he was. The Giordanos expected him to bend the knee or die. The rival families watched him like wolves, waiting to see if the cub would grow fangs. Victoria had understood this immediately, so she'd taught him differently. On nights when Ismail came home, bloodied from fights with boys twice his size, boys who called his father a traitor, who said his mother was a whore for not remarrying into a connected family, Victoria would sit him down at their tiny kitchen table and open a book. Not a Bible, not a self-help manual. Machiavelli, Sun Tzu, Marcus Aurelius. Violence, she'd told him when he was 12, pressing a cold compress to his swollen eye, is the language of men who've run out of words. You're smarter than that. You're better than that. Papa wasn't better, Ismail had muttered. Victoria had gone still. Then she'd cupped his bruised face with both hands, her calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. Your father was brave and loyal, but he was also reckless. He thought power came from fear. He was wrong. Her dark eyes, the same eyes Ismail had inherited, burned with an intensity that made him sit straighter. Real power comes from control. From knowing when to strike and when to wait. From making your enemies destroy themselves while you watch from the shadows. At 15, Ismail had dropped out of school and started running errands for Tommy Benedetto, a mid-level enforcer who controlled the protection rackets in Little Italy. Victoria hadn't tried to stop him. She'd known it was inevitable, but she'd made him promise one thing: never become the man who killed your father. Never be so drunk on power that you forget why you wanted it in the first place. By 20, Ismail was Tommy's right hand. By 25, Tommy was dead from a heart attack that everyone knew wasn't natural, and Ismail had absorbed his entire operation. By 30, he'd forged alliances with 3 of the 5 families, eliminated the Giordanos through a series of calculated federal indictments, and built an empire that stretched from Brooklyn to Miami. And through it all, Victoria had been there. Not in the boardrooms, not at the meetings, but in the quiet moments between the violence, brewing tea at 2 in the morning when he couldn't sleep, listening without judgment when he confessed the things that kept him awake, reminding him that the boy who'd cried over his father's grave was still somewhere inside the man who'd learned to sign death warrants without blinking. 3 years ago, when Ismail had bought the mansion in the hills overlooking the city, 14 bedrooms, marble imported from Carrara, a wine cellar worth more than most people's houses, Victoria had refused to move in. "It's too much," she'd said simply, standing in the grand foyer with her worn cardigan and sensible shoes, looking impossibly small against the cathedral ceilings. "It's yours," Ismail had insisted. "Everything I've built is because of you. She'd touched his cheek the way she used to when he was a child. Then let me live how I choose. I don't need palaces, me Joe. I never did. But 6 months later, she'd fallen on the stairs of her modest brownstone and broken her hip. The recovery had been brutal. Months of physical therapy, infections, setbacks that aged her a decade in weeks. That's when Ismail had simply moved her into the mansion's east wing while she was still in the hospital. By the time she'd been discharged, her entire apartment had been packed up and her new suite prepared modest by the mansion's standards, but with everything she loved. Her armchair by the window, her collection of mystery novels, the photograph of Raphael from before the prison years. She'd been furious for exactly 1 day. Then she'd hugged him and whispered, "You've always been stubborn." "I learned from the best," he'd replied. And for 2 years, it had worked. Victoria had her independence, her own entrance, her own schedule, her own life. Ismail had the peace of knowing she was safe, cared for by a rotating staff of nurses and housekeepers who treated her with the reverence reserved for royalty. Then, 8 months ago, he'd brought Esther Woods home. The first time Victoria met his fiancée, she'd said nothing, just observed with those sharp dark eyes that missed nothing, then excused herself politely after dinner. Later that night, she'd found Ismail in his study. "She's beautiful," Victoria had said carefully. "But," his mother had been quiet for a long moment, "but she looks at this house the way your father's enemies used to look at his territory, like she's already calculating how to take it." Ismail had laughed it off, told himself his mother was being overprotective, paranoid from too many years of running and hiding. Now, watching Esther's trembling hands struggle with the silk ropes, seeing the resignation in Victoria's eyes, not confusion, not fear, but the weary acceptance of someone who'd tried to warn him and knew she'd failed, Ismail understood. His mother had been right. She was always right, and he'd been too blind to see it. The silk ropes fell to the Persian rug with barely a whisper. Victoria didn't move immediately. She sat perfectly still in the Queen Anne chair, her wrists marked with faint red indentations that would fade by morning. Esther had been careful about that too. Her silver hair, usually pinned in a neat bun, hung loose around her shoulders, making her look smaller, frailer, older than her 71 years. But when she finally lifted her eyes to meet Ismail's, there was nothing frail in that gaze. "I'll make tea," she said quietly, rising with the careful dignity of someone who refused to let humiliation define her. "Earl Grey, I think. Unless you'd prefer something stronger." Her voice was steady, controlled, the same tone she'd used when he was 9 years old and came home crying because the Moretti boys had cornered him after school, telling him his father had died screaming like a coward. She'd made him tea that day too. Then she'd taught him how to break a nose without breaking his own hand. "Mama," Ismail started, but Victoria was already moving past him toward the kitchen, her floral house dress rustling softly, her bare feet silent against the hardwood. She didn't look at Esther, didn't acknowledge her at all. It was the most devastating dismissal Ismail had ever witnessed. Esther stood frozen near the fireplace, her emerald gown suddenly looking garish in the amber light, her carefully composed expression cracking at the edges. She opened her mouth, closed it, then reached for her wine glass with a hand that shook just slightly. "Ismail, please," she said, her voice dropping into that breathy, vulnerable register she used when she wanted something. "Let me explain. You don't understand what's been happening. She's been—" "Go upstairs." Esther blinked. "What?" "Go upstairs." He still hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved from his position in the archway, but something in his absolute stillness made her take an involuntary step backward. "We'll talk in the morning, but I need to—" "Now, Esther." She stared at him for 3 long seconds, her jaw tight, her dark eyes calculating. Then she set down her wine glass with exaggerated care, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the grand staircase with her head high, a queen retreating from a battle, not a defeat. The click of her heels against marble echoed through the house until a door closed somewhere on the 2nd floor. Silence flooded back like water. Ismail stood alone in the living room, surrounded by the trappings of power he'd spent 20 years accumulating original Rothko on the walls, furniture that cost more than cars, floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city lights below like a kingdom laid out for inspection. None of it meant anything. He found Victoria in the kitchen, standing at the commercial-grade espresso machine, her back to him as she filled the copper kettle with filtered water. The room was a study in contradictions, industrial stainless steel appliances, alongside the delicate china tea service she'd brought from her old apartment, refusing to use those pretentious cups Esther had ordered from Paris. "You don't have to," he started. "Sit," Victoria didn't turn around. "You've been traveling for 3 days. You must be exhausted." Ismail pulled out one of the bar stools at the Marble Island and sat. The leather briefcase he'd been carrying felt absurdly heavy now. He set it on the floor. The kettle began to hiss softly. Victoria moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades working multiple jobs. Her hands steady as she measured loose-leaf tea into the ceramic pot, arranged cups on a tray, added the honey she kept in a small jar, because she refused to use the fancy stuff from the pantry. Ismail watched his mother's reflection in the darkened window above the sink. The fluorescent under-cabinet lighting cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting every line, every weathered year. When had she gotten so thin? When had her hands developed that slight tremor? How long had he been too busy building his empire to notice? "How long?" he asked quietly. Victoria's hands paused for just a fraction of a second. Then she continued preparing the tea. "How long what, Mijo?" "Don't." The word came out harder than he'd intended. He softened his tone. "Please don't protect me from this. How long has she been doing this to you?" The kettle screamed. Victoria turned off the burner, poured the boiling water over the tea leaves with the same careful precision she'd used to pour disinfectant on his childhood wounds. Steady, thorough, refusing to let her hands shake, no matter how much it hurt. 3 months, she said finally. Maybe 4. It's hard to say exactly when it started. Small things at first. What kind of small things? Victoria brought the tray to the island and sat across from him, her movements slow, deliberate. She looked exhausted, not the exhaustion of a single night, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting a war in silence. She'd suggest I was confused about conversations we'd had. Tell the staff I'd asked for meals I didn't remember requesting. Lock doors and claim she'd told me about the repairs. Victoria poured tea into both cups, the familiar ritual somehow grounding in its mundanity. Then she started with the medication. Ismail's hand tightened around his cup. "What medication?" "For anxiety," she said. "Dr. Grayson prescribed it after I had that dizzy spell in April, do you remember?" "I fell in the garden?" Victoria added honey to her tea, stirring slowly. But the dosage kept increasing, and I started feeling foggy, forgetful. Sometimes I'd lose hours and not remember where I'd been. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you loved her." Victoria finally met his eyes, and the sadness there was worse than any anger could have been. "And because I knew what you'd do if I was wrong. I needed to be certain before I destroyed your happiness." "My happiness?" Ismail set down his cup with more force than necessary. "Mama, she tied you to a chair." "Yes." Victoria's voice remained infuriatingly calm. "Tonight she did, because you came home early, because her timeline accelerated." She took a sip of tea. "She's been planning this for months, Mijo. The medical records, the witness statements from staff she's bribed, the legal paperwork. She's been building a case to have me declared incompetent." The words hung in the air like smoke. Ismail felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest, not rage, not yet, but something more dangerous. The absolute clarity that came before irreversible action. "Why?" His voice was barely a whisper. Victoria reached across the marble island and covered his hand with hers. Her skin was paper-thin, marked with age spots and scars from decades of hard work, but her grip was still strong. "Because I'm the only thing standing between her and everything you've built," she said simply. "As long as I'm here, lucid and present, you'll never make the kind of reckless decisions she needs you to make. You'll never be desperate enough, angry enough, destabilized enough to lose control." She squeezed his hand. "She doesn't want to marry a king, Ismail. She wants to bury one and rule in his place." Ismail didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study until dawn, surrounded by shadows and the faint amber glow of his desk lamp, listening to the house settle around him. Somewhere above, Esther was presumably asleep in their bedroom, the master suite with its king-sized bed and adjoining balcony overlooking the city. He couldn't remember the last time he'd actually wanted to be there. At 6:47 a.m., his phone buzzed. A text from Esther. "We need to talk. I'll be in the morning room at 8. Not a request, a summons. Ismail stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone face down on his desk. By 8 o'clock, he was showered, dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, and standing in the doorway of the morning room watching Esther perform. She'd staged it perfectly. The table was set with fresh croissants from the French bakery she preferred, imported jam, a French press of Colombian coffee. She wore a cream cashmere sweater and tailored slacks, the picture of casual elegance. Her dark hair swept into a loose ponytail, minimal makeup that somehow made her look both vulnerable and striking. When she saw him, her expression shifted seamlessly into concern. "Darling." She rose, reaching for him, but stopped when he didn't move toward her. "I barely slept. We need to talk about last night. About your mother." Ismail stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "I'm listening." Esther's relief was palpable. She gestured to the chair across from hers. "Please sit. Have coffee. You must be exhausted." He remained standing. A flicker of irritation crossed her face before she smoothed it away. "Ismail, I know how it looked. I know you're upset. But you have to understand I was trying to protect her. Protect both of you. By tying her to a chair. Because she was hysterical." Esther's voice rose slightly, then modulated back to concerned calm. She'd been having episodes all day. Aggressive, confused, throwing things. "I called Dr. Grayson twice. He told me to keep her calm until he could come this morning to evaluate her properly." She moved to the sideboard, where a leather portfolio sat waiting. She'd planned this too, every document, every piece of evidence arranged like a closing argument. "Look." Esther opened the portfolio, spreading papers across the table. Medical notes going back 4 months, Dr. Grayson's observations, incident reports from the nursing staff, audio recordings of her confused states. Ismail picked up the first document. It was typed on Dr. Grayson's letterhead, dated 6 weeks ago. Patient presence with increasing confusion, memory lapses, and occasional paranoid delusions. Recommend increased supervision and possible adjustment to current medication regimen. Paranoid delusions, Ismail read aloud. "About what?" "About me." Esther's voice broke just slightly, a masterful touch. "She's convinced I'm trying to hurt her, that I want to take over your business, that I'm poisoning her mind." "Ismail, it's textbook dementia with paranoid features." Dr. Grayson explained it all. He set down the first document and picked up another. This one included timestamps and brief descriptions. 10:15 a.m.s. Patient refused medication. Claimed it was making her sick. Became verbally combative. 2:40 p.m. Patient. Found wandering in restricted wing. Disoriented. 11:30 p.m. Patient attempted to call outside number repeatedly, claiming she needed help. "These are from the nursing staff?" Ismail asked, his voice carefully neutral. "From Nurse Patricia. She's been documenting everything." Esther pulled out another sheet. "And here, this is a neurological assessment recommending a competency evaluation. Dr. Grayson thinks we should file for temporary guardianship, just until we can get her stabilized." There it was. The word his mother had warned him about. Guardianship. Esther moved closer, her perfume something expensive and floral filling the space between them. "I know this is painful. I know you love her. But we have to face reality. Victoria is 71 years old. She's declining. And if we don't act now, while we can still help her with dignity, it's going to get worse. Much worse." She touched his arm gently. "Let me carry this burden with you. That's what partners do. We protect the people we love, even when they can't see that they need protection." Ismail looked down at her hand on his sleeve, the 3-carat diamond engagement ring he'd given her 9 months ago, catching the morning light. The manicured nails painted a subtle rose. Everything about Esther Woods was perfect, calculated, precise. He'd been attracted to that once. The way she moved through his world with such ease, speaking 3 languages fluently, knowing which wine to order, which charities to support, how to smile at the wives of business associates, while subtly establishing dominance. She'd seemed like the ideal partner for a man who'd built an empire on control. Now he saw it differently. She wasn't his partner. She was his competitor. "Where's Dr. Grayson now?" Ismail asked. "He'll be here at 10. I told him about last night. And he's clearing his schedule." Esther's eyes searched his face. "Are you angry with me? Should I be?" "No." She said it firmly, her chin lifting. "I did what any person who loved this family would do. I documented the decline. I called the professionals. And when your mother became a danger to herself last night, I restrained her as gently as possible until help could arrive." She paused. "If you'd found her hurt or worse because I'd ignored the warning signs, you'd never forgive me. You'd never forgive yourself." It was a beautiful argument. Logical, compassionate, impossible to refute without seeming cruel or in denial. Ismail picked up the portfolio, flipping through the remaining documents. More medical notes, more incident reports. A draft petition for emergency guardianship, already filled out except for his signature. A psychological evaluation form. Contact information for a specialist facility, upstate discreet, comfortable, experienced with high-profile families experiencing difficult transitions. "You've been thorough," he said quietly. Esther's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I had to be, for her sake." "And this nurse, Patricia, she's been the primary caregiver?" "For the past 2 months, yes. She's experienced with dementia patients. Very professional. I'd like to speak with her." "Of course." She's downstairs now, preparing Victoria's morning medication. Esther moved to pour coffee, clearly believing the crisis had passed. "Would you like me to call her up?" "No." Ismail closed the portfolio. "I'll go down." Something flickered in Esther's expression, too quick to name. Gone before he could analyze it. "Ismail." She set down the coffee pot. "Before you do, I need you to trust me. I know your mother said things last night, things that probably contradicted everything I'm telling you now, but that's part of the disease. The paranoia makes them convincing, makes them believe their own delusions." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to something intimate, pleading. "Don't let her confusion poison what we have. Please." Ismail met her eyes, those dark, intelligent eyes that had once captivated him. "I'll talk to the nurse," he said. "Then we'll see Dr. Grayson together." "Together." Esther smiled, relief flooding her features. "Yes, that's exactly right." She thought she'd won. Ismail could see it in the way her posture relaxed, the way her hand reached out to squeeze his arm one more time before he left the room. What she didn't see was the single detail that didn't fit. Victoria's confused states and medication refusals were all documented during daytime hours when Ismail was at work, when witnesses were controlled, when the narrative could be managed. But last night, when he'd walked in unannounced, his mother hadn't been confused. She'd been silenced. There was a difference, and Ismail Crespo had built an empire on noticing differences others missed. Nurse Patricia was in Victoria's suite, organizing pill bottles on the nightstand with the methodical efficiency of someone following a routine. She was younger than Ismail expected, mid-30s, blonde hair pulled into a severe ponytail, wearing pale blue scrubs that were spotless despite the early hour. She didn't hear him enter. The door to Victoria's private wing had been left slightly ajar, and he'd learned long ago how to move without sound. His mother was still asleep in the adjacent bedroom, her breathing steady and deep. Exhausted from last night, probably, or sedated. Ismail watched Patricia sort through the medications. Blue pills into one container, white capsules into another. A small liquid vial that she held up to the light, checking the dosage marking with professional precision. "That's quite a collection," he said quietly. Patricia spun around, nearly dropping the vial. Her hand flew to her chest. "Mr. Crespo, I wasn't expecting." Clearly. He stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click. "I'm sorry to startle you. I wanted to check on my mother." Patricia's face cycled through several emotions before settling on professional composure. "Of course. Mrs. Crespo had a difficult night." Miss Woods explained what happened. "I've prepared her morning medications. They should help stabilize her mood." Ismail moved to the nightstand, picking up one of the orange prescription bottles. The label read, "Lorazepam, 2 milligrams. Take 1 tablet twice daily for anxiety. Prescribed by Dr. Richard Grayson 3 months ago." He set it down and picked up another. "Quetiapine, 100 milligrams. Take at bedtime for mood stabilization." And another. "Donepezil 10 milligrams. Take once daily." "That's for dementia," Patricia offered helpfully. "Dr. Grayson started her on it 6 weeks ago when the memory issues became pronounced." Ismail continued reading labels. 5 different medications, all prescribed within the last 4 months. All for conditions his mother had never exhibited in 71 years of life. "Walk me through her typical day," he said, still examining the bottles. "When does she take these?" Patricia relaxed slightly, clearly relieved to discuss her professional protocols. "Morning doses at 8 a.m. the lorazepam and donepezil with breakfast. Quetiapine at bedtime. The others as needed for episodes." "Episodes?" "Yes. When she becomes agitated or confused. Miss Woods has been very attentive about documenting them." Patricia pulled out a small notebook from her pocket. "I keep detailed records. Time, behavior, intervention, response. Standard practice for cognitive decline patients." "May I see?" She hesitated for only a moment before handing over the notebook. Ismail flipped through the pages. Patricia's handwriting was neat, clinical. November 3, 10:20 a.m. Patient refused morning medication. Claimed pills were making her foggy. Became verbally resistant. Administered medication with applesauce per doctor. Grayson's instructions. Patient calmed within 30 minutes. November 7, 2:15 p.m. 10. Patient found in restricted wing attempting to access Mr. Crespo's office. Appeared disoriented. When redirected, became accusatory, claiming she needed to find evidence. Administered PRN lorazepam. Patient rested peacefully afterward. November 12, 11:45 p.m. Patient made multiple attempts to call emergency services. When phone was removed for her safety, became increasingly paranoid. Claimed she was being held prisoner. Emergency sedation required. The entries continued, dozens of them. A comprehensive record of deterioration, or a comprehensive record of something else entirely. You've been very thorough, Ismail said, closing the notebook. Thank you, Mr. Crespo. I take my work seriously. Patricia gestured toward the medications. If you'd like, I can explain what each one does, the side effects, the expected progression. That won't be necessary. Ismail set the notebook on the nightstand beside the pill bottles. I'd like to send these to an independent lab for analysis. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. I'm sorry? Patricia's smile froze. The medications. I want them tested. Make sure the dosages are correct, that there haven't been any contamination issues. Ismail kept his tone casual, almost apologetic. You understand, with my mother's sudden decline, I need to rule out every possibility. Environmental factors, medication interactions, anything that might explain such a rapid change. Patricia's face had gone pale. Mr. Crespo, I assure you, I follow every prescription exactly as written. Dr. Grayson is one of the most respected neurologists in the city. The medications are from a licensed pharmacy. There's no possibility of contamination. Then the tests will confirm that, and we'll all have peace of mind. He began collecting the bottles, placing them carefully in his jacket pockets. I'm sure you understand my concern. She's my mother. Of course, but Patricia's voice had risen slightly. Miss Woods should really be consulted about this. She's been managing Mrs. Crespo's care plan. You can't just take prescribed medications without. I'm not taking them. I'm having them tested. Ismail's tone remained pleasant, but something in his eyes made Patricia take a step back. Unless you have a reason I shouldn't? No reason. This is highly irregular. So is my mother's sudden decline. He picked up the last bottle, the liquid vial Patricia had been checking when he'd entered. What's this one? That's a supplemental medication. For sleep. When the quetiapine isn't sufficient. There was no label on the vial. Ismail held it up to the light, watching the clear liquid catch the morning sun streaming through the curtains. Prescribed by Dr. Grayson? Yes. He provides it directly. It's a compounded medication, so it doesn't go through the regular pharmacy. Convenient. The word hung in the air like an accusation. Patricia's hands twisted together. Mr. Crespo, I really think you should speak with Miss Woods before. I've already spoken with Miss Woods. Ismail pocketed the vial. She's the one who suggested I review my mother's care plan in detail. Make sure everything is being handled properly. It was a lie, but Patricia didn't know that. She nodded slowly, clearly trying to decide whether to push back or retreat. Self-preservation 1. Of course. I'm happy to cooperate with any review. I have nothing to hide. I'm sure you don't. Ismail moved toward the door, then paused. One more question. How long have you worked for my household? 2 months. Miss Woods hired me through an agency that specializes in... Which agency? Elite Home Healthcare Solutions. They're based in Manhattan. Very reputable. And before that? Patricia hesitated. I was working at a private facility in Connecticut. Elderly care. References? Of course. Miss Woods verified everything before I started. Ismail nodded slowly. I'm sure she did. Thank you for your time, Patricia. I'll let you know what the lab finds. He was halfway down the corridor when Patricia called out, her voice tight with poorly concealed panic. Mr. Crespo, when will Mrs. Crespo receive her morning medications? She really should maintain her schedule. Interrupting the regimen could cause significant setbacks. Ismail turned back. My mother is sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. I think we can afford to let her rest. But Dr. Grayson's instructions specifically state, Dr. Grayson, Ismail said quietly, will wait. He left Patricia standing in the hallway, her professional composure crumbling around her like paper in rain. 30 minutes later, Ismail sat in his study with his phone pressed to his ear, listening to the rings echo across the line. Dr. Kovich. The voice that answered was heavily accented, impatient. This better be important. I'm in the middle of... It's Ismael Crespo. I need a favor. The irritation vanished instantly. Ismael, of course. What do you need? Dr. Alexander Kovac was not on any hospital staff. He did not have office hours. His services were retained exclusively by people who needed medical expertise without the inconvenience of official records, insurance claims, or mandatory reporting. Ismael had used him twice before, once to treat a gunshot wound that couldn't be explained to an ER, once to verify cause of death when an ally had died under suspicious circumstances. I need a complete toxicology analysis. Blood work, medication screening, the full spectrum. Ismael set the collection of pill bottles on his desk. And I need it today. Is this for... My mother. Silence on the other end. Then, I'll be there in an hour. Ismael ended the call and stared at the bottles lined up before him like evidence in a trial. 5 different medications, all prescribed in the last 4 months. All for conditions that had appeared suddenly, dramatically, conveniently. His mother's words from last night echoed in his mind. She's been planning this for months. If Victoria was right, if Esther had been systematically drugging her, creating symptoms, building a medical record to support a competency claim, then every pill in these bottles was a weapon, and Ismael needed to know exactly what ammunition he was dealing with. His phone buzzed. A text from Esther. Dr. Grayson is here early. Can you come down? Ismael looked at the message, then at the medications on his desk. He typed back, on my way. It was time to see exactly how good a liar his fiancée really was. Dr. Richard Grayson was exactly what Ismael expected. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, wire-rimmed glasses perched on an aquiline nose. He carried a leather medical bag that looked like it belonged in a period drama and had the kind of confident, compassionate expression that probably calmed wealthy families writing checks for private care. He was also, Ismael noted, visibly uncomfortable. They sat in the formal living room, the same room where, less than 12 hours ago, Victoria had been bound to a chair. Esther had orchestrated the seating arrangements, she and the doctor on the sofa, Ismael in the wingback chair opposite, a coffee service between them. Like this was a civilized consultation rather than an interrogation. Mr. Crespo. Dr. Grayson extended his hand. I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. Your mother is a remarkable woman. Ismael shook his hand, noting the slight dampness of the palm. I'm sorry? Remarkable. You said she's remarkable. Present tense. Ismael settled into the chair, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. So you don't believe she's as far gone as these reports suggest? Dr. Grayson glanced at Esther, who smiled encouragingly. Well, cognitive decline is. It's a spectrum, you understand. Your mother has good days and difficult days. The goal is to maximize quality of life while ensuring her safety during the more challenging periods. How many times have you examined her personally? Another glance at Esther. I've seen Mrs. Crespo 4 times over the past 3 months. Initial consultation, 2 follow-ups, and an emergency evaluation last month when she had a particularly severe episode. And in those 4 visits, you diagnosed dementia, prescribed 5 different medications, and recommended I pursue guardianship. Ismael's tone remained conversational. That seems efficient. Mr. Crespo, I understand this is difficult to accept. What tests did you run? I'm sorry? Cognitive tests, brain scans, blood work. What objective measures did you use to reach your diagnosis? Ismael leaned forward slightly. Because I have the medical records Miss Woods provided, and I don't see any neuroimaging, no comprehensive neurological workup, just your clinical observations and prescription recommendations. Dr. Grayson's jaw tightened. In geriatric psychiatry, clinical observation is often the primary diagnostic tool. Your mother exhibited clear signs of confusion, memory impairment, and paranoid delusions. The medications I prescribed are standard protocol for patients you want to keep docile. The words landed like a slap. Esther's carefully maintained expression cracked. Ismael, what are you? How much is she paying you? Ismael kept his eyes locked on Dr. Grayson. To falsify records, prescribe unnecessary medications, provide expert testimony for a guardianship proceeding. What's the going rate for that kind of service? Dr. Grayson stood abruptly, his face flushing red. This is outrageous. I'm a board-certified neurologist with 30 years of experience. I don't have to sit here and sit down. The command in Ismael's voice was absolute. It was the tone that made hardened criminals reconsider their life choices. The voice that had negotiated treaties and ordered executions with the same deadly calm. Dr. Grayson sat. Better. Ismail pulled his phone from his pocket and opened a document. I had my people pull your medical license information this morning. Very thorough research. You graduated from Columbia, impressive. Practiced at Mount Sinai for 15 years, also impressive. He scrolled down. Then you left rather suddenly in 2019. No explanation in the public records. But my sources found something interesting. He turned the phone around so Dr. Grayson could see the screen. The doctor's face went ashen. A malpractice settlement. Sealed by court order. A wealthy patient's family claimed you prescribed unnecessary psychiatric medications to an elderly woman, kept her heavily sedated while her daughter-in-law systematically looted her estate. Ismail set the phone on the coffee table. The settlement was substantial enough that you lost your hospital privileges. Now you work exclusively private cases, wealthy families, discreet consultations, no oversight. That case was dismissed, Dr. Grayson said weakly. The family was compensated to avoid lengthy litigation. I was never found guilty of, but you did it. Ismail's voice was quiet, certain. And when Miss Woods came looking for a doctor who would be willing to diagnose my mother with conditions she doesn't have, who would prescribe medications to create symptoms rather than treat them, who would provide expert testimony to support a fraudulent guardianship, claim you said yes. The silence that followed was suffocating. Esther finally spoke, her voice trembling with what might have been genuine emotion or exceptional acting. Ismail, this is insane. You're making wild accusations based on what? Your mother's paranoid delusions? Some sealed settlement from years ago? She turned to Dr. Grayson. I apologize for this. He's under tremendous stress. He doesn't know what he's saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Ismail stood, moving to the window that overlooked the city. I also know that 2 hours ago I had my personal physician, Dr. Alexander Kovac. Perhaps you've heard of him, Dr. Grayson? Draw my mother's blood and collect every medication. Nurse Patricia was preparing to give her this morning. Dr. Grayson's face had gone from red to gray. Dr. Kovac is running a complete toxicology panel as we speak. Blood concentration levels, drug interactions, everything. Ismail turned back to face them. If my mother has been systematically overdosed, if the medications were deliberately prescribed to induce confusion and memory loss, if there's any evidence of pharmacological elder abuse, he'll find it. This is ridiculous, Esther said, but her voice had lost its conviction. You're destroying your relationship with your mother's care team based on paranoia. You're going to hurt her by interrupting her treatment. Her treatment. Ismail laughed a cold, humorless sound. Is that what we're calling it? He moved to stand directly in front of Dr. Grayson, looking down at the older man with the kind of intensity that made people confess to crimes they hadn't committed. I'm going to give you one chance to tell me the truth. What medications did you actually prescribe? What were they supposed to do? And what did Miss Woods pay you to make my mother appear incompetent? Dr. Grayson's hands were shaking now. He looked at Esther, clearly hoping for rescue. But she had gone very still, her mind visibly racing through contingency plans. I want my attorney, Dr. Grayson said finally. You'll need one. Ismail stepped back. Because when those toxicology results come back, I'm going to bury you. Your medical license, your reputation, everything. And then I'm going to make sure every family that's ever trusted you knows exactly what you did. You can't. I can. And I will. Ismail's voice was steel wrapped in silk. Unless you start talking. Right now. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked through 15 seconds of silence. Then Dr. Grayson broke. The lorazepam doses were triple what's normally prescribed, he said quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes. And the quetiapine, it wasn't for mood stabilization. At those doses, it causes sedation, confusion, memory, impairment. The donepezil was legitimate, but unnecessary. It's usually given to dementia patients, but in someone without dementia, combined with the other medications, he swallowed hard. It would create symptoms that looked like cognitive decline. And the unlabeled vial? The supplemental sleep medication? Concentrated sedative, haloperidol mixed with a mild paralytic agent. It would cause temporary disorientation, compliance, short-term memory disruption. His voice cracked. She said your mother just needed to be calmed, that she was becoming difficult, that it was for her own good. Ismail turned slowly to face Esther. She sat perfectly still on the sofa, her emerald dress from last night replaced by a dove-gray cashmere sweater, her dark hair immaculate, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Esther smiled, not the warm, loving smile she'd perfected over months of their relationship, but something colder, sharper, more honest. "You should have stayed in Japan," she said softly. "Probably." Ismail's hand moved to his phone. "But I didn't. And now we're going to have a very different conversation than the one you planned." His phone buzzed before he could make the call. A text from Dr. Kovac. "Results preliminary but conclusive. Call me immediately." Ismail read the message, then looked back at Esther. "Last chance," he said. "Tell me everything. Why you did this, who you're working with, what you were planning, and maybe I'll let you walk away from this." Esther stood, smoothing her sweater with deliberate calm. "You want the truth?" She moved toward the bar, pouring herself a glass of scotch, even though it was barely 10 in the morning. "Fine, I'll give you the truth." She took a long sip, then turned to face him with a smile that was equal parts admiration and contempt. "Your mother was right about everything." The scotch glass caught the morning light as Esther swirled the amber liquid, seemingly in no hurry now that the performance was over. "Your mother saw through me the first night we met," she said, her voice stripped of the breathy vulnerability she'd worn like armor. "I could feel it. The way she watched me at dinner, asking those careful questions about my family, my background, my interests. She wasn't making conversation. She was conducting reconnaissance." Ismail remained perfectly still, his phone in his hand, finger hovering over Dr. Kovac's contact, but he didn't press it. Not yet. Dr. Grayson had shrunk into the sofa cushions, clearly wishing he could disappear entirely. "I grew up with nothing," Esther continued, moving to the window where Ismail had stood moments before. "Not the romantic kind of nothing, the desperate kind. Trailer parks and welfare checks and watching my mother sell herself to keep the lights on. Do you know what that does to a child? Watching the world remind you every single day that your life doesn't matter because you weren't born into the right family. So, you decided to marry into one," Ismail said quietly. "I decided to become one." She turned back to face him, her eyes bright with something between ambition and fury. "I made myself into exactly what men like you want. Educated, elegant, cultured. I learned wine and art and how to smile at the right people. I erased every trace of who I was and became who I needed to be. And Victoria threatened that. Your mother was that threat." Esther's voice hardened. "As long as she was here, lucid and influential, I was always going to be the outsider. The fiancée. The woman waiting for approval that would never come because she saw exactly what I was, someone who wanted what she had built." "She built nothing," Ismail said. "She cleaned buildings and worked double shifts. She built you." The words cut through his objection like a blade. "Everything you are, everything you've accomplished, every decision you make, it all flows back to her. The values she taught you, the morality she insisted on, the control she maintains even when she's not in the room." Esther finished her scotch in one swallow. "As long as Victoria Crespo was your conscience, I could never truly have access to your power. You'd always hesitate, always question, always wonder what she would think." Ismail's jaw tightened. "So you tried to erase her." "I tried to remove the obstacle." Esther set down the glass with deliberate care. The medications were supposed to make her compliant, confused enough that her objections wouldn't matter. The medical records would establish a pattern of decline. The guardianship would transfer decision-making authority to you and, by extension, to me as your wife. She smiled without warmth. Then the real work could begin. "What real work?" "Destabilizing your empire." She said it like it was obvious, inevitable. "You've built too carefully, Ismail. Too much restraint, too many rules, too much honor among thieves. But men like you make mistakes when they're emotionally compromised. Lose your mother to dementia, watch her fade away in some facility while you're consumed with guilt that would have made you reckless. And you'd be there to help me make those reckless decisions. I'd be there to guide you toward the right partnerships. The Kozlov family has been very interested in your shipping routes. The Delgado cartel would pay handsomely for your distribution networks. There are a dozen organizations willing to pay premium prices for pieces of what you've built, if only someone was willing to sell." The room seemed to tilt. "You were going to dismantle everything," Ismail said slowly. "Piece by piece. Using me as the front while you sold my empire to the highest bidders." "Our empire," Esther corrected. "Once we were married. Community property, darling. 50% mine the moment we signed the papers." She moved closer, her voice dropping to something almost intimate. "And if something unfortunate happened to you afterward, a retaliation from a rival family, perhaps? or a tragic accident during one of your increasingly reckless operations, I'd inherit the rest. The grieving widow. Young, capable, ready to negotiate with interested parties. You planned to kill me. I planned for every contingency. Esther's smile was sharp as broken glass. But you're making this sound so mercenary. I did care for you, in my way. You're brilliant, powerful, attractive. If you'd been willing to be a true partner to share power instead of hoarding it, things might have been different. A true partner wouldn't drug my mother. A true partner would have recognized that your mother was a liability. Esther's mask slipped slightly, showing genuine frustration. You let a 71-year-old woman dictate your choices. Her values, her morality, her endless lessons about honor and control. She turned you into a crime lord who thinks he's a philosopher. You could have been so much more. The phone in Ismail's hand buzzed again. Another text from Dr. Kovac. We need to talk. Now. But Ismail didn't look down. He was staring at Esther Woods, really seeing her for the first time. Not the elegant fiancée who'd charmed his associates and decorated his home and smiled beside him at benefits, but the desperate, ambitious survivor who'd clawed her way out of poverty by becoming whatever she needed to be, and who viewed his empire the way a conqueror views territory to be claimed. Who else is involved? He asked. Does it matter? It matters very much. Esther laughed, a genuine sound this time, bitter and almost admiring. You think I'd tell you? So you can dismantle my entire network before I walk out that door? I'm ambitious, Ismail, not stupid. You're not walking out that door. No? She tilted her head, studying him. Are you going to kill me? Right here in front of the good doctor? That seems sloppy for a man who prides himself on control. I don't need to kill you. Ismail's voice was colder than she'd ever heard it. I just need to make sure you can't hurt anyone else. He pressed the contact for Dr. Kovac. The call connected immediately. Ismail, what did you find? Chronic benzodiazepine toxicity, antipsychotic overdosing, sedative hypnotic poisoning. Your mother's been systematically drugged for months. Dr. Kovac's accent thickened with anger. Whoever prescribed this knew exactly what they were doing. These doses would create every symptom of dementia, while avoiding acute toxicity that would show up in a standard medical exam. It's sophisticated pharmacological abuse. Can you document it? Medical legal standard? I'm already preparing the report. This is elder abuse, Ismail. Criminal charges, medical board investigations. Whoever did this is finished. Good. Ismail kept his eyes locked on Esther. Send the report to my attorney. Copy to the state medical board. And add Dr. Richard Grayson to the list of responsible parties. Dr. Grayson made a strangled sound. There's more, Doctor. Kovac continued. The long-term effects your mother's lucky you caught this when you did. Another few months, and the cognitive damage might have been permanent. The words hit Ismail like a physical blow. Permanent damage. They'd almost succeeded. Not just in declaring his mother incompetent, but in actually making her incompetent. Destroying the brilliant, fierce woman who'd raised him until nothing remained but the confused shell Esther's medical records described. How long until she's clear? He asked. The benzodiazepines will clear in a few days. Full cognitive recovery may be a month, assuming there's no permanent damage. I'll need to monitor her closely. Run follow-up tests. Whatever she needs. Ismail ended the call and turned back to Esther. You almost destroyed her. Almost. Esther's voice held no remorse. But you came home early. Bad timing for both of us. A sound from the doorway made them all turn. Victoria stood there, wearing a simple linen robe, her silver hair loose around her shoulders. She looked small, fragile until you met her eyes. Those dark eyes that had watched empires rise and fall, that had buried a husband and raised a son in a world that wanted to devour them both, that had seen through Esther Woods from the very first night. Not bad timing, Victoria said quietly, her voice steady despite the months of pharmacological torture. Perfect timing. She walked into the room with slow, careful dignity, not because she was weak, but because she refused to let them see her shake. Ismail moved immediately to her side, but she waved him off gently. I can stand, mijo. She looked past him to Esther. I need to say this while I still remember. Mama, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Victoria moved to the center of the room, and suddenly it was clear who commanded the space. For 4 months, you told me I was losing my mind, that my memories were false, that my concerns were paranoid delusions. Esther said nothing. You drugged my food, locked me in rooms and claimed I'd wandered, tied me to chairs and called it care. Victoria's voice remained calm, factual. You told the staff I was dangerous. You had that man. She gestured toward Dr. Grayson without looking at him. Write reports claiming I was incompetent. Mrs. Crespo, I'm so... Dr. Grayson started. Be silent. Victoria's command was absolute. She turned back to Esther. But the worst thing you did, the cruelest thing, was make me doubt myself. There were days when I thought you might be right. When the fog was so thick I couldn't remember what was real anymore. When I wondered if I really was going insane. A single tear traced down her weathered cheek. Those days, Victoria continued, her voice breaking slightly, were worse than any physical pain you could have inflicted. You didn't just try to take my mind. You tried to take my truth. Esther's composure finally cracked. You were in the way. I was his mother. The words carried the weight of absolute certainty. And you will never understand what that means, because you don't know how to love anything you can't own. The silence that followed was profound. Then Victoria turned to her son, reaching up to touch his face with a trembling hand. Thank you, she whispered, for believing me when I couldn't believe myself. Ismail caught her hand, pressing it against his cheek. Always, Mama, he said. Always. The next 72 hours passed like a carefully choreographed performance, with Ismail playing the role of a man who didn't know he'd already won. He sent Dr. Grayson home with a quiet warning that sounded almost like mercy. Disappear. Retire. Move somewhere warm and never practice medicine again. If I hear your name connected to another patient, if you so much as write a prescription for aspirin, I will make sure that sealed malpractice settlement becomes front-page news. The doctor had left so quickly he'd forgotten his medical bag. Esther, however, stayed. That was the dangerous part, the game within the game. She'd confessed to everything in a moment of arrogant certainty, believing that the truth didn't matter because Ismail couldn't act on it without exposing himself. A mafia boss couldn't exactly call the police to report his fiancée's conspiracy. The legal system wasn't built for men like him, but she'd made one critical miscalculation. She thought he'd react with emotion, with rage or heartbreak, or the reckless violence she'd been counting on to destabilize him. Instead, Ismail did what he always did when facing an enemy who'd shown their hand too early. He smiled. And he waited. We need to talk about what happens next, he'd said that afternoon, finding Esther in the conservatory where she'd retreated after Victoria's testimony. She was reading a book or pretending to her posture perfect, her face composed. She'd looked up with cautious hope. I wasn't sure you'd want to talk to me. I don't want to. Ismail had sat across from her, his body language open, vulnerable. But I need to, for both our sakes. I meant what I said earlier, Esther had ventured. About caring for you. I went about things the wrong way. I see that now. I was desperate, afraid of losing you. It was a masterful pivot, reframing conspiracy as insecurity, abuse as misguided love. Ismail had let her spin the lie. My mother will recover, he'd said carefully. Dr. Kovac says a month, maybe less. We'll keep her here. Supervised care. No more outside nurses. No more medications except what Kovac approves. Of course. Esther's relief had been palpable. Whatever she needs. I want to make this right, Ismail. I want us to heal from this. Do you? Yes. She'd reached across the space between them, her hand hovering near his. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. But I love you. And I hope you still love me too. Ismail had taken her hand, watching her eyes light with desperate optimism. I need time, he'd said, to process everything, to make sure my mother is stable. Can you give me that? Of course. Anything. And I need you to do something for me. Esther had tensed slightly. What? The people you were working with, the Kozlov family, the Delgado cartel, whoever else was part of your plan. I need you to contact them. Tell them the timeline is accelerating. Tell them I'm unstable, vulnerable, ready to make deals. She'd gone very still. Why would you want me to? Because I need to know who they are. Ismail had leaned forward, lowering his voice to something intimate, conspiratorial. You were right about some things, Esther. My mother does constrain me. Her values, her morality, they've made me cautious when I should be bold. Maybe it's time to explore new partnerships, opportunities I wouldn't have considered before. The lie had been perfectly calibrated, equal parts confession and manipulation. Esther's mind had raced behind her eyes, calculating, adjusting, seeing a path forward where moments before there'd been only ruin. You mean that? I mean, I'm tired of being controlled by the past. Ismail had squeezed her hand. Help me understand what you were building. Show me the vision you had for our future. If it makes sense, if I can see the value, maybe we can salvage something from this. It was exactly what she'd wanted to hear. The possibility of redemption. Of still winning, even after the confession. I'll need to make some calls, she'd said slowly. Explain that things are evolving, that you're open to discussions. Do it. Ismail had stood, pulling her to her feet, but carefully. I don't want anyone knowing about the last few days. As far as anyone outside this house knows, everything is fine between us. What about your mother? My mother stays in her suite until she's recovered. The staff thinks she's ill, which is true. No one needs to know the details. Esther had nodded, already planning, already adapting. There's one more thing, Ismail had added, stopping her as she'd moved toward the door. I'm hosting a dinner, 1 week from tonight, private, intimate. I want to meet these potential partners of yours. Face to face, no intermediaries. Here? In the house? Where else? Ismail had smiled. I need to see who I'm getting into business with. And they need to see me. The unstable, vulnerable version you've been promising them. Esther had studied him for a long moment, looking for the trap. But Ismail had learned long ago how to be whatever someone needed him to be. In that moment, he'd been the grieving son, the compromised leader, the man whose moral compass had finally cracked under the weight of betrayal. A dinner, she'd repeated. 1 week. Can you arrange it? I can arrange anything. The old confidence had crept back into her voice. How many guests? You tell me. However many key players you need to make this work. She'd smiled then, the predatory smile she'd hidden for months behind warmth and devotion. I'll make the calls tonight. And she had. Over the next 6 days, Ismail watched Esther orchestrate her own destruction with the efficiency of someone who thought they were building an empire. She made calls from the East Terrace, thinking he couldn't hear. She scheduled meetings at cafes in the city, believing he wouldn't follow. She sent encrypted messages on her laptop, not knowing he'd installed monitoring software the morning after her confession. Every contact she made, every potential ally she reached out to, every piece of her conspiracy, Ismail documented it all. Dmitry Kozlov's representative, offering to optimize shipping routes through Eastern Europe, a Delgado cartel lieutenant, interested in expanding distribution partnerships, a corrupt attorney named Harrison Webb, who specialized in hostile takeovers of criminal organizations, a financial consultant who laundered money through art galleries and real estate, even a rival crime family, the Benedettos, Tommy's cousins who'd been waiting years for an opportunity to reclaim what Ismail had taken. All of them hungry, all of them circling, all of them about to walk into Ismail Crespo's home thinking they were negotiating the dismantling of his empire. Esther believed she was conducting a symphony. She didn't realize she was composing her own requiem. On the 6th day, Ismail found his mother in the library, reading in the afternoon light. Her color had returned. Her eyes were clear. The fog that Esther's medications had created was lifting day by day, revealing the sharp, formidable woman who'd raised him. You look better, he said, sitting in the chair beside hers. I feel human again. Victoria closed her book. Doctor, Kovac says I'm recovering ahead of schedule. The mind is resilient when given a chance. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Don't. She reached over and took his hand. She was very good at what she did. If you hadn't come home early that night, she would have succeeded. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. There's a dinner tomorrow night, Ismail said finally. Esther thinks she's bringing her allies here to negotiate my surrender, to finalize the plans she's been making. And what will they find instead? Truth. Ismail's voice was quiet, certain. Every piece of evidence I've gathered, every conversation I've recorded, every ally she thought was secret. I'm going to let her build the trap completely before I spring it. Victoria studied her son's face, the face she'd watched grow from a frightened boy into a man who'd learned to control violence instead of being controlled by it. What will you do with her? She asked. After? I don't know yet, Ismail admitted. But whatever it is, it won't be quick. She tried to take you from me. She tried to destroy everything you built in me. That's not a debt paid with a bullet. No, Victoria agreed quietly. It's not. She squeezed his hand. But remember what I taught you. Control the violence. Don't let it control you, even when the person deserves it most. I remember, Mama. Ismail stood, pressing a kiss to her forehead. I remember everything you taught me. Tomorrow night, Esther Woods and everyone she'd conspired with would walk into his home expecting to witness the fall of a king. Instead, they'd learn why Ismail Crespo had survived in a world that ate the weak and punished the careless. Not because he was the most violent, but because he was the most patient. and his patience had just run out. The dining room had been transformed into something between a boardroom and a throne room. Ismail had overseen every detail personally. The long mahogany table that could seat 16 was set with bone china and crystal that caught the chandelier light like ice. Each place setting included a leather portfolio, empty now, but waiting. 7 guests were expected. 7 conspirators who thought they were coming to negotiate the dissolution of Ismail Crespo's empire. They began arriving at 8 o'clock. Dmitry Kozlov's representative came first, a man named Alexei Petrov, with cold eyes and an expensive watch. He moved through the foyer like he was already calculating square footage and resale value. Next came Isabella Delgado, the cartel lieutenant who wore designer suits and had personally ordered the deaths of 43 people. She kissed Esther's cheek like they were old friends. Harrison Webb, the corrupt attorney, arrived with a briefcase full of contracts. The financial consultant, a woman named Patricia Chen, brought spreadsheets. 2 Benedetto cousins, Frank and Joseph, came together, their eyes scanning the mansion with barely concealed resentment. Esther played hostess with flawless grace, guiding them all to the dining room, pouring wine, making introductions as if this were a legitimate business dinner rather than a conspiracy to commit organized theft and probable murder. Ismail watched from the hallway, invisible in the shadows, counting heads. All present, all accounted for. He entered the dining room at precisely 8:30, and the conversations died instantly. "Thank you for coming," he said, moving to the head of the table. "I know you all have busy schedules. I appreciate your discretion." Esther sat at the opposite end, her emerald dress replaced tonight by something even more striking, black silk that made her look like a widow already in mourning. She smiled at him encouragingly, believing they were partners now, co-conspirators in her grand design. "Esther has told me about the opportunities you've all presented," Ismail continued, remaining standing while the others sat. "Partnerships that could expand my operations significantly. New markets, new distribution channels, new revenue streams." Alexei Petrov leaned forward. "The Kozlov family is prepared to offer very generous terms. I'm sure you are." Ismail's voice was pleasant, conversational. "Before we discuss terms, however, I'd like to share some information with all of you. Context that I think will help frame our negotiations." He pressed a button on a small remote. The lights dimmed. Screens descended from the ceiling at both ends of the room, modern technology hidden in the classical architecture. "What is this?" Isabella Delgado asked. "Transparency," Ismail said simply. The screens flickered to life. Audio began playing, Esther's voice, clear and unmistakable. "Your mother was the obstacle. Remove her, and he becomes manageable, predictable." Esther's face went white. The recording continued. Snippets of phone calls, carefully edited but devastatingly complete. Her voice describing the drugging strategy. Her laughter when discussing Victoria's confused states. Her cold calculation about timelines and inheritance laws. Then the screens shifted to documents. Medical records, the real ones from Dr. Kovac, showing systematic poisoning. Toxicology reports with highlighted sections. Dr. Grayson's confession, recorded and notarized. "Jesus Christ," Frank Benedetto whispered. But Ismail wasn't finished. New audio began, Esther's calls to each person in this room, her promises about what she could deliver, her assurances that Ismail was compromised and vulnerable and ready to be manipulated. "He's weak right now. His mother's condition is destroying him. He'll agree to anything if we position it correctly." The screens showed text messages, encrypted emails that Ismail's people had decrypted, financial transactions, payments from Kozlov accounts to Esther's hidden offshore accounts. Contracts Harrison Webb had drafted for the systematic liquidation of Ismail's assets. Every piece of the conspiracy, displayed in excruciating detail. Alexei Petrov stood abruptly. "This is, I was told you were open to discussions." "Sit down." Ismail's voice cut through the room like a blade. Petrov sat. "You were told," Ismail continued, his voice deadly quiet, "that I was weak, vulnerable, easily manipulated. That my mother's condition had compromised my judgment and made me desperate for new partnerships." He moved slowly around the table, placing his hand on each empty chair as he passed. "What you weren't told is that my mother was being systematically poisoned by my fiancé, that the condition you were counting on was pharmacologically induced, that every piece of leverage you thought you had was built on elder abuse and fraud." The silence was suffocating. Ismail stopped behind Esther's chair. She sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap. "In my world," he said softly, his eyes scanning each face at the table, "there are rules. You can challenge territory. You can compete for markets. You can even try to kill me, if you're brave enough and stupid enough." He leaned down, his voice dropping to something only Esther could hear clearly. "But you never ever disrespect a man's mother." He straightened, addressing the room again. "I invited you here tonight because I wanted you to understand something. Every call you made, every meeting you attended, every plan you contributed to, I documented it all. Your conspiracy isn't secret anymore. It's evidence." Harrison Webb's face had gone gray. "You can't take this to authorities." "I don't need to." Ismael smiled without warmth. The door to the dining room opened. Victoria Crespo entered. She wore a simple navy dress, her silver hair swept into an elegant bun, and she moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had survived everything life had thrown at her and refused to be diminished by any of it. The room fell into a silence so complete that the grandfather clock in the hallway could be heard ticking through the walls. Esther's composure finally shattered. Her face crumbled, showing raw panic for the first time since the evening began. "Mrs. Crespo," Harrison Webb started, rising awkwardly from his chair. "We had no idea." "Sit down, Mr. Webb." Victoria's voice was soft, but carried absolute authority. "All of you. I have something to say, and you're going to listen." She moved to stand beside her son, and Ismael stepped back slightly, giving her the center of the room. This moment belonged to her. "For 4 months," Victoria began, her eyes moving from face to face around the table. "I was told I was losing my mind, that my memories were false, that my fears were paranoid delusions created by a diseased brain." Her voice remained steady, factual, devastating in its calm. "I was drugged, systematically and deliberately. Medications that created confusion, memory loss, disorientation. I was tied to chairs and told it was for my own safety. I was locked in rooms and told I had wandered there myself. I was gaslighted so thoroughly that there were days I believed I truly was going insane." Isabella Delgado looked away, unable to meet Victoria's gaze. "The woman who did this," Victoria continued, her eyes finally landing on Esther, "sat in this house, ate at this table, smiled at my son, and every single day worked to erase me. Not to kill me, that would have been too obvious, but to make me disappear while I was still breathing, to turn me into something so confused and helpless that no one would believe a word I said." She moved closer to the table, her hands resting lightly on the back of an empty chair. "And all of you were willing to benefit from that abuse. You knew she was compromising him through his mother. You knew something wasn't right, but you didn't ask questions because you wanted what she was offering." "Mrs. Crespo, with all respect," Alexei Petrov said carefully, "we were told you were ill. We had no reason to suspect." "You had every reason." Victoria's voice sharpened. "In this world, my son's world, you don't survive without instincts, without asking questions, without verifying what you're told." She paused. "You ignored your instincts because greed made you stupid." Frank Benedetto shifted uncomfortably. "We weren't part of what she did to you. We were just willing to profit from it." Victoria finished. "Which makes you complicit." She turned to look at Esther, who sat frozen at the far end of the table, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "You asked me once," Victoria said softly, "what it was like to raise a child alone in this world, to teach him values when violence was the only language spoken around us, to make him believe honor still mattered when everything he saw suggested it didn't." Esther said nothing. "I told you it was the hardest thing I'd ever done, and you smiled and said you admired my strength." Victoria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "What you didn't understand, what you still don't understand, is that strength isn't about taking power. It's about knowing when to hold it and when to let it go. It's about building something that lasts beyond your own ambition." She moved closer to Esther, stopping just a few feet away. "You tried to destroy the one thing in this world that mattered more to my son than his empire. You tried to take his mother from him, not through death that would have been cleaner. You tried to make him watch me fade away, confused and helpless, until there was nothing left of the woman who raised him." Victoria's voice broke slightly, but she didn't look away. "That was your mistake. Not the conspiracy, not the greed, but fundamentally misunderstanding what you were attacking. I'm not just his mother. I'm the reason he has a conscience. The reason he can rule through respect instead of fear. The foundation everything he's built stands on." She straightened, her composure returning like armor. "When you poisoned me, you poisoned that foundation. And my son," she glanced at Ismael, pride evident in her eyes, "does not forgive threats to his foundation." Victoria turned back to address the entire room. "I want all of you to remember this moment. Remember that you stood in this room, expecting to negotiate the destruction of a good man's empire, because a desperate woman convinced you he was weak. Remember that you confused compassion for vulnerability, love for liability. She moved toward the door, then paused. And remember that the most dangerous men in this world aren't the ones who rule through violence. They're the ones who learned control from women who refused to let cruelty define their sons. Victoria left the dining room with the same quiet dignity she'd entered with, and somehow the space felt emptier without her presence. Ismail waited until his mother's footsteps faded down the hallway before he spoke again. "Stand up, Esther." She remained seated, her hands gripping the edge of the table as if it could anchor her to a reality that was rapidly dissolving. I said, "Stand up." This time she obeyed, rising on shaking legs, her black silk dress suddenly looking like a costume she no longer had the right to wear. Ismail moved to stand directly in front of her, close enough that the others couldn't hear him speak. "I'm not going to kill you," he said quietly. "That would be too easy, too quick. You'd become a martyr in your own mind, the woman who almost pulled off the perfect con before the vengeful crime lord struck her down." Esther's breath came in shallow gasps. "Instead, I'm going to let you live. But everything else, everything you built, everything you schemed for, everyone who ever believed in you, that ends tonight." He stepped back, addressing the room again. "Here's what happens next. All of you leave this house. You return to your organizations and you explain how you were played by someone who thought drugging an old woman was the path to power. You live with the professional consequences of that stupidity." He turned to Alexei Petrov. "The Kozlov family will receive documentation proving you were negotiating behind their backs, using their resources to fund a personal venture. I doubt they'll be pleased." Petrov's face went ashen. "Miss Delgado, the cartel doesn't take kindly to operators who make unauthorized deals, do they? Especially deals that could have exposed their distribution networks to federal investigation." Isabella Delgado stood slowly, her hand moving toward her purse. "Don't," Ismail said softly. "You're outnumbered, outgunned, and already finished. Leave with some dignity." She froze, then nodded once and moved toward the door. "Mr. Webb, I've already forwarded your draft contracts to the State Bar Association. I'm sure they'll be very interested in your creative interpretation of estate law and elder abuse statutes." The attorney grabbed his briefcase and practically ran from the room. One by one, the conspirators fled, stripped of their leverage, their credibility, their futures. Frank and Joseph Benedetto left without a word, knowing their family would demand answers they couldn't provide. Within minutes, only Ismail and Esther remained. "What about me?" she whispered. "What happens to me?" "You wanted my empire," Ismail said. "You wanted the power, the money, the status. So let me show you what real power looks like." He pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. It displayed a bank statement, her offshore accounts, the ones she'd thought were hidden. The balance read 0. "Your money's gone. Donated to organizations that support elder abuse victims. Your apartment downtown foreclosed on this afternoon. Your credit cards canceled. Your professional connections, I've made sure everyone knows exactly who you are and what you did." Esther's knees buckled. She caught herself on the chair. "But I'm not having you arrested," Ismail continued. "I'm not having you disappeared or harmed or eliminated, because that would make you a victim. And you're not a victim, Esther. You're a predator who got caught." He moved to the door, then looked back one final time. "You're free to go. Leave this house. Leave this city. Start over somewhere else with nothing. Just like you started the first time. Except now, everyone knows your name and what you're capable of." "Ismail, please. My mother endured 4 months of torture because of you. 4 months of thinking she was losing her mind. 4 months of fear and confusion and violation." His voice was ice. "You'll endure the rest of your life knowing you had everything and threw it away because you couldn't understand that some things, some people are not conquests to be claimed." He opened the door. "Get out of my house." Esther walked past him on trembling legs, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. She paused at the threshold, opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it and disappeared into the night. Ismail stood alone in the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of the dinner half-filled wine glasses, abandoned portfolios, the lingering scent of expensive perfume and cheaper desperation. His phone buzzed. A text from one of his lieutenants. "Surveillance confirms she left the property. No tail. She's alone." Ismail typed back, "Good. Make sure she stays that way." He walked through the mansion toward the east wing, where light still glowed from his mother's suite. He found her sitting in her favorite chair by the window, a cup of tea cooling on the side table, her eyes fixed on the city lights below. "Is it done?" she asked without looking at him. "It's done." Victoria nodded slowly. How do you feel? Ismail sat in the chair across from her, the same chair he'd sat in countless times as a child, as a teenager learning the family business, as a man seeking counsel. Empty, he admitted. I thought I'd feel satisfaction. Victory. But mostly, I just feel tired. That's because vengeance is exhausting. Victoria finally looked at him. Justice, though real justice that brings peace. Did I do the right thing? Letting her go? His mother reached across and took his hand. You did exactly what I taught you. You controlled the violence instead of letting it control you. You made her face consequences without becoming the monster she believed you were. She squeezed his hand. I'm proud of you. Those 4 words, I'm proud of you, meant more than every dollar in his accounts, every territory under his control, every victory he'd ever claimed. What now? Ismail asked. Now? Victoria smiled. Now we remember that empires are temporary, but family is forever. Money can be stolen, power can shift, but the values we hold, the dignity we maintain, that's what defines us. She stood, moving to the window, and Ismail joined her. Together they looked out at the city, the kingdom he'd built through calculation and patience, through the lessons she'd taught him in that cramped apartment above the butcher shop, through the understanding that true strength came from knowing when to fight and when to wait. She wanted to rule an empire, Victoria said softly, but she never understood that the real power was standing right in front of her the entire time. What power was that? Victoria turned to her son. Her dark eyes, the eyes he'd inherited, filled with the wisdom of someone who'd survived everything and refused to be broken. A mother's love, she said simply. The one thing that can't be bought, stolen, or destroyed. The foundation that holds even when everything else crumbles. Ismail pulled his mother into an embrace, and for the first time in months, he felt the weight he'd been carrying finally lift. Esther Woods had wanted his empire, but she'd never understood that his real empire, the thing worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth everything, was standing in this room, drinking tea, teaching him that mercy could be more devastating than vengeance. And that lesson, like all his mother's lessons, would stay with him forever. Thanks for staying with this story right till the final moment. You're the reason these stories come alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to see your thoughts and connect with you down there.